I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Today, Sunday, January 11th, is shaping up to be a terrible day for Sean Combs because Netflix has just released what 50 Cent is calling the next chapter of The Reckoning. And this time it does not feel like a simple continuation, but more like a deliberate statement. Because when it appeared on Netflix, there was no extended promotional rollout, no months of build-up, no press tours breaking down what viewers were about to see. It just arrived quietly and unexpectedly, almost as if it was never meant to make noise at first, just to exist. And that alone says a lot, since when powerful stories surface without warning, they are usually about timing rather than entertainment. Because back in December when Sean Combs' The Reckoning first dropped, most people believed that was the complete story. For carefully structured parts diving into Diddy's empire, the allegations, the investigation, the people around him, and the moment right before everything unraveled. And that documentary already shook the industry as careers went silent. Statements disappeared, and conversations shifted. Yet even then it felt unfinished, with scenes that cut away too quickly. Questions raised but never fully followed. Names mentioned without context, and gaps that felt intentional. Something 50 Cent never tried to hide, as he kept repeating that what people saw was only a portion of what actually existed. And now this new release makes that clear, because it does not try to explain Diddy's rise, revisit his legacy, or educate casual viewers. It assumes you already know what happened in December, and instead moves the focus away from the public narrative and toward what was happening behind closed doors. A shift that changes everything as the tone becomes tighter, heavier, and more uncomfortable. No longer about reminding you who Sean Combs was, but about questioning why certain things were never shown before and why they are being shown now. And before going any further, remember to like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this story is moving fast. And what makes this release unsettling is not that it openly claims to expose brand new truths, but the way it reframes old ones, placing moments that once felt isolated side by side, giving weight to conversations that previously seemed harmless, and letting the lack of explanation speak louder than any accusation ever could, especially since this does not drop in a vacuum but arrives while legal appeals are pending. Civil lawsuits continue quietly, the industry stays largely silent, and people who once spoke freely are now choosing their words carefully or saying nothing at all, with that silence becoming part of the story because the documentary does not say, "Here's what happened," but instead asks why this was never addressed. A question that lingers once it is raised. And this chapter also feels different because it does not seem aimed at the audience first, but inward toward the industry itself. Toward people who understand exactly what certain clips, recordings, and images mean without needing them explained on screen, with much left unsaid on purpose, because power is not challenged by shouting but by context. Making this chapter quiet, patient, unhurried, allowing moments to sit long enough for discomfort to settle in, and discomfort becomes dangerous when it lingers. Because what you are watching is not a sequel trying to outdo the first, but a recalibration, a repositioning, almost like someone saying you thought that was everything when it was not. And that realization that the story may not be finished is what makes today feel different, since once the possibility of more exists, silence no longer works the same way. And what adds even more weight is what this chapter refuses to do, with no dramatic voice telling you what to think, no flashing labels, no narrator spelling out accusations. Just a slower pace that allows patterns to form naturally by placing moments side by side and letting the audience connect them, which is far more unsettling than being handed a conclusion. As you begin noticing how often certain names appear near certain situations, how timelines overlap in ways never openly discussed, and how people who once seemed separate were actually moving through the same rooms, the same circles, the same nights, with nothing shouted and everything implied through proximity, which is where the tension truly lives, because implication forces memory to do the work. And this chapter also stands apart by avoiding public moments like award shows, red carpets, and interviews everyone has already seen, instead lingering in the in-between spaces such as after parties, private conversations, planning stages, and moments just before cameras were meant to stop rolling. The kind of moments that rarely make it into documentaries. And that shift in tone is something you feel immediately. The pacing tightens as scenes stop resolving the way you expect. Conversations end abruptly, and footage cuts away right when your mind starts forming questions. And none of that is accidental, because that restraint signals confidence, showing that creators are not trying to persuade anyone but are instead placing the pieces on the table and stepping back. And another thing that stands out is how carefully context is handled, since nothing appears on its own, with every clip, moment, and voice surrounded by quiet buildup that shows where people were, who else was present, and how often the same configurations repeat over time. Because repetition carries power as it turns coincidence into pattern, and patterns are what investigations rely on rather than isolated incidents. While there is also an emotional shift that is hard to miss, because the earlier documentary carried a sense of revelation, whereas this one carries a sense of consequence, with an energy that feels colder, less reactive, almost resigned. Like the story has moved past shock and into the phase where reality settles. Which is when reputations become vulnerable because outrage fades but records remain. And what is especially striking is how little commentary is required as long stretches pass without explanation while the meaning continues to build. Since you are not told why something matters, but are shown enough to understand that it does, and once you recognize it, it cannot be unseen. Because this chapter does not ask for belief, but assumes awareness. Trusting that viewers remember what was said months ago. Who denied what? Who stayed silent, who spoke too early, and then disappeared. And that trust allows you to feel the weight of what is missing just as much as what is present, changing the relationship between the documentary and the audience, so that you are no longer being guided but implicated as a witness. Which is where the real power lives, because once a story shifts from watch this to remember this, it stops being content and starts becoming record, and records do not disappear quietly. And by this point it becomes clear that this is not about fresh shock value, but about reframing what people thought they already understood. As the documentary does not rush ahead but circles back, revisiting moments once treated as footnotes and placing them at the center, not to accuse but to recontextualize, making what once felt random now feel arranged. As you begin noticing how often stories were told without follow-ups, how many questions were acknowledged but never answered, and how silence repeatedly became the closing statement instead of clarity. And when those moments are stacked together, minutes apart rather than years apart, the tone shifts completely into discomfort, not because of what is shown, but because of what suddenly makes sense. With the documentary leaning heavily into timing by focusing on when statements were made, when responses never came, and when narratives quietly shifted without explanation, subtly asking whether time was used as a shield not to heal, but to distance. Since distance dulls urgency, and urgency threatens power, and what ultimately makes this approach so effective is its refusal to editorialize. With no dramatic music instructing the audience when to react, there are no captions spelling out implications. The film simply places moments side by side and lets the viewer feel the friction between them. And that friction creates heat as you start recalling interviews you have seen before that now feel different, with answers that once sounded confident suddenly feeling incomplete, and statements once taken at face value now coming across as carefully worded, not untrue but selective. And selection itself is a form of control, because this chapter also highlights the gap between how narratives were managed publicly and privately, what was said on record versus what was handled off camera, and how often those two worlds failed to align. Not claiming deception but emphasizing separation, since separation allows plausible deniability, and the more you watch, the clearer it becomes that this is not about exposing a single moment but about revealing a method, a consistent approach to managing attention by letting issues surface briefly, generate noise, and then waiting. Because waiting has always been the safest strategy, but it only works when people forget. And that is the shift happening now, as the audience is no longer forgetting but revisiting, replaying, and comparing, and comparison strips narratives of their protective fog, making what once felt like isolated controversy now feel like part of a larger, unfinished conversation. And the documentary never tells you what conclusion to reach, instead doing something far more effective. By removing the comfort of certainty and leaving you with unresolved questions that were never meant to stay alive this long. Questions that do not fade but grow. And this is the stage where the story stops belonging to the people involved and starts belonging to memory itself. A memory that does not reset with new headlines or move on simply because time has passed. Which is why this chapter feels heavier, not louder or angrier, just heavier, because once patterns become visible, silence no longer feels neutral and starts to feel intentional. And an intention, once noticed, changes everything. As the documentary begins to feel less like a release and more like pressure, not pressure from accusations but from continuity. From the fact that once events are lined up, they no longer scatter but hold shape. And shape is dangerous because it implies design. And in this section everything slows even further as the lens widens and asks a quieter question. Not what happened, but why certain moments were allowed to pass without resolution. Why some stories were treated as too complex to revisit. And why explanations were always deferred to later, when later never seemed to arrive. And what is most unsettling is how familiar this pattern feels once it is pointed out, with a controversy surfacing, attention spiking, a brief, controlled, incomplete statement appearing, and then time stepping in to do the rest. Becoming the cleanup crew, a process the documentary frames not as coincidence, but as habit. A habit built over years, refined through experience. and protected by reputation. Because when reputation becomes strong enough, it fills in gaps automatically, and people assume the explanation exists somewhere, even if they have never actually heard it. An assumption, as the film makes clear, is powerful. It replaces evidence with comfort, forcing the viewer to confront how often comfort was chosen over clarity, how silence was mistaken for dignity, and how unanswered questions were dismissed as old news simply because enough time had passed. Even though time never resolves stories, it only spaces them out, and when those spaces collapse, when decades of moments are compressed into a single viewing, the gaps become impossible to ignore, almost loud. And this is where the documentary shifts away from individuals and toward systems. Systems that understand attention, fatigue, and how public memory can be shaped not through denial, but through patience. Because patience looks harmless, mature, and reasonable until you realize it never ends. As the film places moments back to back that were never meant to exist together, not to suggest guilt but to remove isolation. And once isolation disappears, each moment gains weight from the ones surrounding it, making pauses feel longer, answers feel shorter, and silences feel heavier, all without narration, pushing conclusions, or dramatic claims. Just proximity, sequence, and timing. Because timing tells stories, words never need to. And by this point, the audience is no longer waiting for a reveal but for a response. Not a statement or denial, but real engagement that acknowledges the full picture instead of fragments. Since fragments can be managed, but wholes cannot. And this is where the story quietly turns, as silence stops acting like a shield and starts revealing itself as strategy rather than wrongdoing. And once strategy becomes visible, the relationship between power and the audience changes, with viewers no longer reacting but observing, and observation lingers even after the screen goes dark. Because the documentary has subtly and irreversibly shifted the viewer's role from watching to be informed to watching to verify, weighing every new moment against what has already been seen, comparing pauses, and treating every decision not to speak as part of the record. And where power once expected attention to fade and momentum to die, the opposite happens as the film leans into repetition, not of clips, but of behaviors. The same types of answers across different years. The same tone in entirely different situations. The same reliance on reputation to carry conversations that were never finished. And repetition feels procedural rather than dramatic, suggesting intent, which becomes uncomfortable once you realize how effective this approach has been for so long. Not because anyone was fooled, but because the system never needed to trick anyone. It only needed to slow things down, let discomfort fade, let memory fragment, and allow time to do what denial never could. Something that worked for years, until this chapter exposed how silence was not passive but active, carefully timed and placed, appearing precisely when clarity would have forced alignment between stories better kept separate, making you notice how often explanations stop just short of specificity, how conversations pivot away from time, and how accountability is replaced with generalities that are not false or provable but incomplete. Because incompleteness protects. Complete stories demand follow-up while incomplete ones invite patience. And patience has always favored those in control. And what makes this section hit harder is that it never accuses or escalates or raises its voice. It simply refuses to let moments exist alone, stacking them, compressing time, and removing the gaps where forgetting used to live, until the audience sees something they cannot unsee. Consistency, not of actions but of avoidance, restraint, and knowing exactly how much to say and how much not to, which is why the story feels heavier. Not because new information appears, but because old information stops feeling resolved. Reopening moments once considered handled, and quietly challenging the long-held belief that silence equals maturity or growth, by raising a dangerous idea without ever stating it. That silence might not be strength but isolation, a question that lingers without needing an answer, because once the viewer asks it themselves, the balance shifts. And at that point, the story no longer relies on momentum. It has gravity, and gravity does not rush, it pulls. At this stage, the story changes in how it feels. You're no longer wondering what comes next, but watching how everyone moves now that the room knows it's being observed. Because once patterns are visible, reactions matter more than revelations. And the documentary doesn't chase drama but slows down, letting silence stretch just long enough for you to see who is comfortable in it and who isn't. With some speaking freely and others keeping distance, not because they have nothing to say, but because anything said creates a reference point. And reference points are dangerous when the past is being reassembled rather than forgotten, which is when the audience stops consuming and starts measuring tone, timing, and how quickly narratives adjust under quiet pressure. And that pressure is real, not loud, not online, but internal to the structure that once relied on time to blur details. Since time no longer blurs anything, with every resurfaced interview feeling different, every old clip gaining new weight, and statements that once seemed neutral now calculated, designed to say enough without closing the loop, creating tension that is subtle but persistent, because nothing explosive happens here, and that's why it works. as patterns settle in, repeat, and force recognition without asking for belief. And what's unsettling is how predictable responses become once you understand the system, with pauses appearing in the same places, language softening on the same topics, accountability acknowledged in theory and redirected in practice, showing that this isn't chaos, but control. And control doesn't panic when questioned, it waits, assuming patience will fade into fatigue and attention will drift. But that assumption is failing, as the audience asks steadier, structural questions rather than reacting emotionally, watching how narratives protect themselves without saying they need protection, turning silence from neutral into a signal, one that shows certain explanations would create clarity over comfort. Some conversations are riskier to finish than to avoid, and distance still feels safer than alignment, which, once noticed, cannot be unseen, with the documentary trusting viewers to reach these conclusions themselves, because independently reached conclusions stick harder than anything told. And at this point, the story gains weight without volume, letting the lack of response speak louder than statements, with every quiet choice adding pressure. And the audience begins reading every move differently, not because anyone is accused or anything is proven, but because silence no longer signals the end of conversation, showing that the story feeds on what exists and what hasn't been addressed, letting absence do the work, revealing how names fade, voices go quiet when context matters, and responses shortened as questions clarify, all measured with restraint used as positioning the choice to say less, appear less, explain less, because explanations leave trails, and trails invite comparison. The real threat, showing that narratives survive not by controlling every detail but by controlling engagement, since unengaged stories leave old material unresolved, which is where power prefers to sit, suspended, creating tension that tightens rather than explodes. And this chapter lets that tension breathe, lingering with discomfort and letting viewers realize that many moments once treated as isolated were actually part of a continuous pattern, changing how past statements, confidence, and distance feel. Not because new information emerges, but because coherence replaces coincidence, highlighting who speaks comfortably and broadly versus who avoids specifics, who embraces clarity and who circles it. Subtle shifts where long-term strategies live. And it's in this subtlety that the documentary becomes dangerous. Not to individuals, but to systems that rely on patience outlasting curiosity, expecting attention to move on before connections form, an expectation no longer safe because the audience waits, observes, and logs. And quiet observation doesn't burn out like outrage, it feeds on consistency. The more consistent the avoidance, the clearer the structure becomes, marking the phase where the story stops asking for reactions and begins inviting evaluation. And evaluation doesn't require belief. It requires memory that now stretches across years without gaps, and once those gaps vanish, silence loses its cover, no longer feeling like maturity or restraint but like a choice that keeps repeating itself. And repetition, once noticed, becomes the loudest statement of all. And this is where everything shifts. Not because of a single clip or one shocking moment, but because the story stops feeling accidental. Since up until now, it's been easy for people to tell themselves this was just noise, just another documentary, just another cycle of headlines. But here the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. And what changes is the lens. You're no longer watching for revelations. You're watching for reactions. And the reactions, or lack thereof, tell a deeper story than any piece of footage ever could. As this is the moment when viewers realize power doesn't collapse when exposed. It adapts, it slows, it gets quieter, because silence buys time. And time has always been the safest place for unfinished stories. But this time isn't erasing anything. It's stacking it, making it possible to notice how quickly narratives shift away from specifics. How conversations that once felt confident suddenly become vague. How explanations stop just short of clarity, not denial. Not confirmation, just distance. And distance is the strategy. And once that is recognized, the entire past rearranges itself, as interviews previously seen take on new weight. Statements that once felt complete now appear carefully framed, and moments brushed off as coincidences begin to line up with uncomfortable precision, marking the point where the documentary stops guiding you and lets you connect the dots on your own. Because conclusions reached independently stick harder. They don't feel planted, they feel earned. And that is the turning point, not when something new is said, but when nothing new needs to be said anymore. From here on, silence becomes data, with every pause noticed, every absence logged, every non-response adding pressure rather than relieving it. And pressure doesn't need noise to work, it just needs consistency, which is when the balance quietly shifts, and the narrative no longer belongs to the people at its center but to the timeline itself, to memory, comparison, and context. As the audience stops asking what will be revealed next and begins asking why this was never addressed before. A question that doesn't fade but deepens, not accusatory but structural, about how long certain conversations were allowed to remain unfinished, How often clarity was postponed, how frequently silence was treated as resolution. And once viewers recognize that pattern, the story becomes irreversible. Not louder, not messier, just heavier, with everything that follows measured against what didn't happen in the past. And that is a standard silence cannot escape, making it clear this isn't the peak of drama.